Good morning. We're going to go ahead and start the meeting. Good morning, everyone. So, Rosie, are we ready to begin the meeting?
Yes, Madam President, we are.
Okay, it's 9 a.m., and I call the meeting March 14th, 2025 meeting of SDCERS Board of Administration to order. Rosie, do we have a quorum?
Yes, Madam President, we do have a quorum with the following members absent: Mr. Brett Bartolotta and Louis Gwynn.
Okay, great. And before we move on to the agenda, it's my honor to take a moment to recognize our Board of Director, Tom Battaglia. Today will be his last meeting serving SDCERS as a board member, and while he was elected twice by the SDCERS active members to serve, he will always be known as a champion of the trust in keeping all member interests in mind. And Tom has a special note of appreciation for serving as our disability chair since 2023. As a board member with the earliest start date going back to January 2017, so it's that long ago, huh? Your organizational history and experience will be missed. We thank you for your board service and look forward to providing you service as a SDCERS retiree. On behalf of the board, and on behalf of the board, it is my honor to present to you a certificate of appreciation for your board service, and it was signed by all of us, and we'd like to take a picture with you at around 10:30. So you want me to give this to you now, or you want to wait? Yes.
Can't wait. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Great.
Nice.
And Tom, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah.
Do you want me to put it over here or something?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Lisa Marie. As I step down from my position on the Board of Administration, I'd like to take a moment and reflect on my journey since 2017 and express my sincere gratitude for the opportunity to serve alongside such dedicated and passionate individuals. First, I'd like to thank the general membership for your support in voting me into this role multiple times, and I have no doubt that Kent Morris will continue to protect the trust the same way I did over these many years. It has been an incredible privilege to work with all of you in addition to serving with the past board members and staff. I'm proud of my many accomplishments we've achieved together. Among the list of 40-ish accomplishments that Greg helped me gather, I'd like to highlight some of them now. In 2017, we lowered the investment assumption to 6.75, and again in 2018 lowered it to 6.5%. We were one of the few early adopters with these rates. In 2018, we added the UAL amortization floor to the city and port plans. Since 2017, we hired a new CEO, new internal auditor, new deputy CEO, new HR director, new chief investment officer, new chief information officer, new member services director, new benefits administrator, new medical review officer, and a new board secretary, to name a few, among many other SDCERS staff who have been hired. Other than Johnny and Ted, I believe all other leadership positions have turned over. We operated under COVID-19 restrictions with the remote working and remote committee and board meetings, and we successfully reopened the city plan for Prop B unwinding. These achievements are a testament to the hard work and vision of everyone involved, and I'm honored to have played the part in our shared success. I'd also like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the exceptional staff, both current and past. Your commitment to the mission of SDCERS has been inspiring, and it's been a pleasure to work with alongside such a dedicated and talented group of individuals. I'm grateful for the wisdom and support you have all offered throughout my time on the board. I'd like to say a special shout out to Rosie. Your professionalism, compassion, and lunch menu choices are exceptional. I'm going to miss our side chats between the morning meetings and lunch getting prepared to look so delightful. While I'm stepping down from my role, I remain deeply committed to the mission of SDCERS and will continue to support its success in any way I can. I have full confidence that the organization will continue to thrive under the leadership of the dedicated team we've built, and I look forward to seeing the continued progress in the years ahead. Thank you once again for the trust, collaboration, and accomplishments we've shared since I've started. I wish you all the very best, and I'm excited to see the bright future that lies ahead. Thank you.
Well, thank you again, Tom. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize Bobby Spoon. She will be completing her second four-year term at this meeting. While there is a two-year term limit on SDCERS board service, we are very fortunate that Bobby, as an appointed member, has agreed to exercise the option to carry over until the City of San Diego appoints her replacement. And thank you so much, Bobby, because we need you. We appreciate your continued service and will keep your recognition certificate safely hidden away for another day. But thank you, Bobby. So forgive me, I still have several more announcements. We should also take a moment to recognize 3 board members who are completing their first four-year term, and that includes Michelle Bush. Thank you, Michelle. Louis Nguyen, and me, the board president, Lisa Marie Harris. Both Michelle and I are requesting the mayor to recommend our reappointment to the board to carry to the city council. Louis will not be seeking another term like Bobby, but he will be carrying on until the city appoints another board of director. Also, I'd like to take a moment to recognize 2 board members who are completing their first four-year term successfully and re-elected to the board, and that includes Brett Bartolotta and Paul Lott. So thank you so much for continuing your service. And a note of appreciation for continued service to the Board of SDCERS. And my final announcement, that I have an unavoidable calendar conflict which requires me to leave shortly after we take the picture, but fortunately I have a very capable vice president I will turn over the meeting, and thank you in advance, Cliff. So with that, moving on to section 3 for public comments. Rosie, do we have any public comments today?
No, Madam President, we don't have any public comment for today's meeting.
Okay, great. So moving on to section 4, approval of the consent agenda items, which include service retirements, drop entries, drop retirements, training, and the board calendar. Before I make a motion for the approval of the consent items, are there any board members that have any comments on the consent calendar or agenda? No one? Okay, so let's take a vote.
And Madam President, this was moved by yourself, Lisa Marie Harris, seconded by Thomas Battaglia, and with all votes in, this motion passes 10-0.
Okay, thank you. So this finishes our consent agenda items, and we'll now move to section 5 of business and operations. We have 3 action items on the business and operations agenda this morning, starting with our first action item, election of the board president. Greg, would you please introduce this action item?
Certainly. Good morning, board members. It's a pleasure to see you all this morning. Thank you for coming here today. Before the board is an action item for the election of board president. The board's policy titled Board Process on Election of Board President and Appointment of Vice President provides a member of this board may serve as president for 2 consecutive one-year terms. Our current board president, Lisa Marie Harris, is finishing her first year term and is eligible to serve the board for a second-year term as board president. From my perspective, Lisa Marie has served with distinction as our board president. And the good news is she is willing to serve as our board president for a second year should you so desire. If it's the board's desire to have Lisa Marie continue as board president, now would be an appropriate time for a motion and a second.
Paul Oates, second.
And Madam President, this was moved by Roberta Spoon, seconded by Michelle Bush, and with all votes in, this motion passes 10-0. Congratulations.
Thank you. It's been an honor and a pleasure to work with you all and serve the trust, and I really appreciate your leadership as well, and thank you for your just vote of confidence in me at leading this board. Thank you. So with that, we'll move on to business and operations action item number 2, staff recommendation to adopt the June 30, 2024 valuation reports for the City of San Diego, the San Diego Port District, and the San Diego Regional Airport Authority. So with us today, yes, we have our actuarial valuation reports with Sharon, with Jean, and Alice. Jean, please begin when you're ready.
Thank you. Good morning. We're As you recall, we were here in January presenting the preliminary actuarial evaluation results, and we're now presenting the final results, and the results haven't changed. So we're going to cut short all the material that was presented in January and just get to the essence of what the results show. And then what we always do every March is compare you to your peers, both nationally and in the state, and then we finish with some projections. In the appendix, we've included some of the material that we're not going to go over that was presented in January. One of the questions that came up January was how we dealt with the negotiated salary increases. And I'm not sure we explained it as clearly as we could. What you're looking at are those negotiated salary increases in 24, 25, and 26. When we collected the June 30th data, we bumped up that data by the gray shaded areas up there, which were the 7/1/2024 and the 1/1/2025 pay increases. We did not bump it up further for the following 2 years. And the reason being, there was a concern that by doing that, we're in effect changing assumptions. Because who's to say that in 25, perhaps the salary increases would be lower in 26? So what was known and done by the time we presented the evaluation, we reflected. What isn't known or done yet, we did not reflect. And the only difference is that you're going to fund those increases starting a year later. But I'm going to turn to Alice and talk about special salary adjustments and her favorite topic, Prop B.
Yes, thank you. So as far as special salary adjustments, in the negotiated increases, there's a group of increases on the salary that are general salary increases, and those are reflected in the valuation, but the special salary adjustments are not reflected because those are specific to job classification, and that's not information that we receive to the granular level of job classification when we receive the actuarial evaluation data. So when we do the year-over-year valuation, we see those liability losses, and a lot of the liability losses attributable to salary increases. There is the part of that loss that comes from those special salary adjustments. And then the other piece of information that's reflected in this year's valuation is the funding for Proposition B Phase 3. So we came before you in November of 2024 to explain another piece of liability that was being incorporated into SDCERS, and that was for the members who had been hired during the freeze period and then terminated. And those members had the opportunity to opt into SDCERS. So when should they ever rehire down the road, they had that opportunity to have their prior service included in any future benefit. So of the about 1,000 members who were in that group of eligibility, approximately 200 opted in. Now 30 of those have since been rehired. So there's an unfunded element and a normal cost element, which is added to the upcoming 7/1/2025 ADC, which we'll see in the results coming up.
So these are the summary of the results for the city. In the blue area, the membership counts. In the gray area, assets and liabilities. And in the gold area, the contributions. Things of note, if you look in the membership section, there was a spike in the active head count of 7.6, and the average salary went up by 8, and the combination of those two is why the projected payroll increased by 16%. On the assets and liabilities, you'll see the funded ratio slightly increased both on a smooth and market value basis. The unfunded liability also increased by just under 4%. If not for the salary increases, the unfunded liability would have been lower than the prior year. And we'll get into the details on that. And then on the ADC, you see we've gone up from 486 to 533, and on the next slide we'll get into the details of what caused that. So again, on the liabilities, the first column, actuarial liability, you'll see the liability experience was $267.1 million, more than expected. 200 of that was the salary increases, and the rest was a combination of termination, rehires, and I will point out that we were spot on with mortality. So all those adjustments we made in recent years worked. And you see the Prop B added 14.4, but then on the asset side, it picked up 12.7, so the net on the unfunded was very small, 1.7. And again, you see we expected the liability to drop the UAL by 113 million. And finally, on the ADC, we expected it to increase by at least 11, but 37.2 contributed to the majority of the increase in the ADC.
Moving on to the port, so the new information for the port for the 2024 cycle was the new tier of benefits was put into place that began January 1st, 2024. And that new tier of benefits is following the PEPRA plan provisions for the general members. And you'll see in the active membership increased by 18.6%, and that increase was due to that new plan tier. The prior tier for general members had members waiting 5 years before they became eligible for SDCERS, and with the new tier, that eligibility becomes effective immediately, and so we saw a spike in the active count for all those members who had been sitting in that waiting period who are now part of the system. On the actuarial liability side, the liabilities increased by 5.3%, and the actuarial value of assets increased by 4.3%, which means that the funded ratio for the plan decreased slightly from 78.7% to 78%. In terms of the ADC, we have the components of that actuarially determined contribution, normal cost, UAL payment, and administrative expenses, taking the contribution from 21.2 million to 22.8 million in the coming year.
Alice, I had a question. So during that 5-year waiting period, were they in the system?
They were what we called in the tunnel, and so they were not eligible for membership until the first day of their sixth year of employment.
Or were they contributing into the system?
They were not contributing.
So
No,
they were not. So that 5-year period, they have no pension.
that's correct.
Okay.
And we see a similar reconciliation as we did for the city. The left column, the liabilities, the second column to the left, the assets, moving to the UAL and the ADC. So that actuarially determined contribution at 21.2 million was expected to decrease by 0.7 million, and the actual asset experience for the plan came in slightly higher than the 6.5% assumed, closer to 7% on an actual basis, which decreased the ADC by 0.2 million. But then the liability experience increased that contribution by 2.4 million, largely due to salary increases, again, for the membership. So a total change of 1.5 million to 22.8 million. The airport continues to fund their system, their plan, in excess of the actually determined contribution in order to stick with their board's funding policy of arriving at that 95% funding ratio goal or higher. And we see on the airport side, in terms of membership, they had a steady growth of 8.5% increase and an average salary increase of 2.3%. Their actuarial funding ratio, if we look in the middle section there, their funded ratio increased from 93.3% to 94%. And that increase of 0.7% was largely due to the additional contributions that they put into their plan in order to meet their funding objectives. As far as the reconciliation goes, they were similar expectations in terms of the actuarially determined contribution. That contribution was expected to decrease by 89,000. The actual asset experience, which came in above the 6.5%, decreased the ADC by 27,000, but then the liability experience increased it by 201,000 for a net increase of 85,000, moving from the 6.052 million to 6.137 million for the coming year.
Now we'll compare SDCERS to nationally to other large public sector plans. There's presently over 200 plans in this database maintained by Boston College Center of Retirement Research. And these are the percentiles, and the higher up you are, the higher, obviously, the discount rate. But you can see in 2005, 6, and 7, you were more on the high side compared to other plans. And then as you started dropping your discount rate, the gold dots started declining. And then if you look at 2018, 19, and 20, you were, at the lowest level of nearly all plans. But other plans now are also lowering their discount rates, and that's why you're now sort of in the middle of that percentile, 75th to 95th. On a funded status basis, yep.
Just the quartiles, that's just the sheer numbers of plans.
Yes.
The universe, has it changed much?
I think it was about 160 plans in the beginning here, or 150.
Right.
And now it's closer to 250.
Yeah.
But I will point out in 2023, if you look at the footnote, this is the data as of 12/9/2024. So there was a number of plans that haven't yet reported that are not in that. Moving to the funded ratio, we're looking at the funded ratio on a market value basis. You can see you were sort of in the lower parts in the early years, in particular in 2009. That's right after the Great Recession, and then steadily improved, and you were in the highest quartile there. And recently you're slipping down, but only because the other plans have also lowered their discount rates. And if you notice the title of this slide, it says normalized. We're putting everybody at 6.5%, adjusting their liabilities. If other plans have already gotten there, there's no further adjustment made. So the bottom line of these two slides are you're still on a conservative basis with the discount rate, and in a relatively stronger position on a funded status. But now, I know in California, it's more important where you compare to your peers in California. So I will turn it over to Alice.
Great. So we take a look at a similar comparison, but only looking at the systems in California. So there are 39 systems in the summary here, looking at the discount rate of those 39 systems. And we can see where SDCERS sits in terms of the funded ratio over the 10-year period, always consistently in the lowest quartile of that discount rate assumption. And we see in the lower graph that there are 5 plans at the 6.5%. 2 years ago, there were only 2 plans in that 6.5%. So the trend is continuing to decrease that discount rate across the systems within California. As for the funded ratio comparing to other systems in California, we are showing on the gold dot the city specifically, because as we know, the city, the port, and the airport all have different funded ratios. So that gold dot is showing where the city stands compared to the peers. And down below, we see that the majority or the largest number of plans are in that same group as SDCERS in the 70 to 75% funded ratio. Now, the port would be in one column over in the 75 to 80% at a 78% on a market value, and the airport would be taking its way up towards in the third highest there in the 90 to 95, and their goal is to reach that 95 and up with their board policy.
So the last part of our presentation are the projections. And This projection that you're seeing here is only reflecting the salary increases in 7/1/2024 and 1/1/2025. And if you, well, do we have new board members? We do have one, right? Do you want me to explain the chart?
Not yet.
Okay, not yet. So then you've seen these charts before. The top chart are the liabilities and assets. The bottom chart are the contributions, the gold bars are the city contributions. The dark blue are the member. And the red line is a baseline. As we start changing things, that red line won't move. And so you can compare, for example, on this slide, which is reflecting just the 24 and 25 salary increases, flip to the next slide.
Gene, could I just ask you a question on this? So I know Cliff didn't want me to refer to that undulation there at 2042 as the cliff. So I'm going to, but what I want to ask you is, a while ago, was that decline, did that not occur in 2039, I think, something like
Yes.
that? And so the increase, the salary increases and so on pushed that out, is that right? Or what happened?
That could have, but remember my favorite, your favorite quote of my predictions, that first column to the far left will never happen. So that drives it, and you'll see in a couple slides later, we're going to show this same chart, assuming that you earned 16.5% this year, and we'll also show that you earned a negative 3.5, and you'll see how dramatically different the cliff is based on investment returns. But for this year, yes, it's probably the salary increases that largely pushed it out.
Okay, but just following up on that comment you made on the side there. So in January, you made some projections to us, and basically what we're seeing here is they proved out, correct? Between
These are no
January
different
and
than what we presented this in January.
Okay, so I'm kind of disappointed in that because you have in the past guaranteed that your projections are going to be wrong, and in this particular case, over the last 2 months, they've proven right. So what's going on?
It's on an annual basis.
Oh, okay.
But if you look at this chart and the next one, which brings into 26 pay increases, you could barely see a difference. So that's my point earlier, that not reflecting those increases really has an immaterial impact here. But if you go to slide 20, you can see the hard numbers a lot easier. We're just repeating in the bottom half of this slide. Repeating in the bottom half of the slide what we showed earlier. In the gray area is what we reflected. So on the top part of this graph, the ADC, if we only did the gray part, would be 533 and 540, and there you see the unfunded liability, 3.49 billion, dropping to 3.34 billion. And if we brought in for this valuation the 26 pay increases, the ADC go up about 7 million. And you can see the increase in the UAL. Now, let's suppose you earn 16.5%. Now, Chris, you see where the cliff now has moved way back. No, I'm sorry, Chris. We should call it Chris's cliff. But
Rather than the cliff, you said when we reach 100% funding.
When you reach 100% funding. And that's largely driven because you've got that UAL floor policy. But you see, are we on 21 up there? Yep. That red line is where you are if you earned the 6.5 every year, and the gold bars are the impact of earning 16.5. And you see the vast number of years that the 100% funding has declined by. But on the other hand, and maybe more relevant to today's stock market trends, if you earned minus 3.5% for the year, this shows you the increases. And if I'm eyeballing this, about $23 million increase in the ADC from expected with this kind of a result, and it's probably roughly the same decrease with the 16.5% result.
And taking a look at the baseline projections for the port also has that UAL payment floor, which holds them at a steady contribution all the way until 2044, once the plan reaches full funding, and then the contribution rate declines sharply. And the airport is much higher funded. They do not have that UAL payment floor. There's a steady contribution growth in the initial years shown here, and that's because the amortization bases that are currently in continue to be paid off, and then there's a large base that drops off, and we see some varying changes in that contribution rate before the full funding comes back into play, and then there's a steady increase in the contribution rate due to the normal cost and the growth of the membership over time.
And that concludes our presentation. Happy to answer any further questions.
I have a quick question. Just curious, in the one chart where you showed that there were 4 similar counties in California or jurisdictions that were at 100%. I'm just curious who those are, and is there a theme there amongst them that how they got to 100%?
I know 2 of them would be the city of San Jose's general system, the city of San Jose Fire and Police.
Those are both
And they have traditionally been very well funded. And they're currently in litigation because they're overfunded, yet their normal cost is going up. So they increase the ADC for their employer. And the employer says, why are our costs going up? So now they're in the courts fighting about that, which is very interesting.
So for those that are 100% funded, are they
I'm sorry,
unique
it's
in
Fresno.
that they made additional payments along the way to get to that level, or is it just through their investment strategy?
Part of it could be the benefit structure, whether some of these systems increase benefits, salary experience. I don't think that they're, and contributions, the funding policy, but I don't think investments would play a much of a role at all.
Okay.
So they didn't get stock options from internet startups located in San Jose, California, or anything along the way?
And I apologize, I misspoke. It's the city of Fresno, not the city of San Jose.
Okay.
Oh,
I
Fresno.
apologize.
I thought so, because we work on San Jose, and I
Yeah,
was
I'm like-
shocked.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that.
I'm staring at Fresno here, but I didn't want to, jump on that. Yeah.
So maybe they don't have strong benefits anyway.
Well, and they're probably smaller systems.
That's what I was wondering. Is it they're smaller systems?
They are.
And remember, you're on the lower side when it comes to the state, but then nationally, you're on the higher side. But on the national level, it's all very large plants, whereas on the California, you've got a lot of smaller plants.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions for Jean or Alice? Okay, well, can we have a motion for approval? Okay, let's vote. Oh, agenda. Thank you.
Mr. Maggi, would you like to cast your vote? It was moved by Thomas Battaglia, seconded by Clifford Shearson, and with all votes in, Madam President, this motion passes 10-0.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jean and Alice. We'll see you again soon. Okay, we'll move to business operations action item number 3, actual audit services firm selection. Greg, I'll turn over to you.
Thank you very much. The San Diego City Employees Retirement System, we hire an independent actuarial service firm to perform actuarial consulting services. We just heard from our consulting actuary, Chiron. And the substance is to do evaluation of checking on our funding status and also to set employer and employee contribution rates as appropriate for the next coming fiscal year. And it is a best practice to occasionally, on a periodic basis, check the veracity or actually audit the actuary to make sure that their calculations are appropriate. So SDCERS issued an RFP, request for proposal for actuarial audit services in November of 2024. The RFP solicited proposals from qualified and experienced actuarial audit firms to audit the June 30th, 2024 valuations for each of our 3 plan sponsors. SDCERS advertised this RFP on its website and sent notices to known actuarial firms providing services to large California public pension plans. SDCERS received responses from Kavanaugh McDonald, Foster & Foster, Gabriel Roeder Smith, Milliman, and the Siegel Company. An RFP review panel consisting of Karina Coleman, our Chief Investment Officer, Johnny Tran, our General Counsel, and myself evaluated each proposal, and unanimously we determined that one firm, Milliman, as the best overall option to provide actuarial auditing services at a cost not to exceed $80,000. And so staff therefore recommends the board select Milliman as our actuarial auditor at a cost not to exceed $80,000 and direct your Chief Executive Officer to negotiate and execute a contract.
Awesome. Are there any questions for Greg? No? Well, can we have a motion? And a second. Great, thank you.
It was moved by Chris Brewster, seconded by Thomas Battaglia, and with all votes in, Madam President, this motion passes 10-0.
Thank you, Rosie. So this finishes our business and operations agenda items. Now we'll move to Section 6, Audit Committee. So Audit Committee Chair Bobby Spoon, would you please provide an Audit Committee report?
The Audit Committee met this week on Wednesday, and we had one action item, staff's recommendation to approve Internal Audit's 2026 budget, 2026 performance obligations, and the External Quality Assurance Plan. As a result of new global internal audit standards, Sarah Dixon brought forth 3 items requiring Audit Committee approval. 1, the 2026 internal audit budget, the 2026 performance obligations, and number 3, the external quality assurance plan. This was approved by all Audit Committee members present. The vote was 4-0. That was our only action item. The information item was a Prop B unwinding audit report, terminated employees. Sarah Dixon presented the results of the Prop B unwinding audit over terminated employees, otherwise known as the city's Phase 3. The internal audit report was issued in November 2024. We heard reports from Sarah on the Port District's remediation efforts in their internal audit that has been ongoing for several years. And we also received a report from Michelle with an IT update. And that was it. Our next meeting is scheduled for July. That's it for audit.
Okay. Thank you, Bobby, for that committee report. We'll now move to Section 7, Disability Committee. Disability Committee Chair Tom Battaglia, would you please provide us a Disability Committee report?
The Disability Committee met yesterday and unanimously approved all 3 action items on today's Disability Committee's consent agenda. We'll discuss the consent items 1 through 3, and then the board will vote on these as one motion. Are there any action items the board would like to pull for a separate vote? Seeing none. Starting with consent agenda items 1 and 2, approve the industrial disability retirement applications for Michael Hayes and Tammy Hodgsack. These 2 applications for industrial disability retirement were approved by the committee, and as they are for the same type of benefit and following applies to each application, the committee approved these members' application for industrial disability retirement as each application was supported by evidence of being permanently disabled, being attributed to their work duties, and causing the need for leave in employment. Are there any questions from the board? Seeing none. So, should we move? Not yet? Okay.
All 3.
So then, consent agenda item number 3, approve the request for Kevin Bellin to waive the 2-year deadline and allow him to apply for the industrial disability retirement. The committee approved this request by Mr. Bellin to waive the 2-year deadline rule, as staff believes SDCERS will be able to investigate the member's application. Are there any questions from the board on this item before I move and approve the consent items 1 through 3? Seeing none. So I'll move to approve and then ask for a vote.
And with all votes in, Mr. Chair, this motion passes 10-0.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tom, for your committee report. Are you finished?
One more item.
Okay.
The disability report provides an overview of disability application review statistics, highlighting the caseload is in good shape with a caseload of 15 applications, with all but one within the 18-month processing window, which has been delayed due to the member's non-related health condition. If there's no questions, then back to you, Lisa Marie.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tom, for your committee report. Are there questions? Go ahead.
I just wanted to comment that at the last board meeting, we had some discussions around drop and so on, and you had asked that go back to a committee to be addressed. So there was some good conversation there at Disability, and we've come up with a recommended way to address this that will go to B&G at the next meeting and then to the board, and seems like everybody's comfortable with the solution.
Awesome. Glad you're able to come to a consensus.
You bet. Thank you.
Any other further questions before we move on? Okay, we'll move to the Business and Governance Committee, and we'll have our chair, Bobby Spoon, giving her committee report.
All right. The B&G committee met yesterday. We have 6 action items on consent. Starting with consent agenda number 1, staff's recommendation to approve the results of the 2025 Active General and Fire Safety Board member election. It was presented by Jessica Taylor. Jessica Taylor, the communications manager, presented the results of recent board elections. Kent Morris and Brent Bartolotta received the majority of votes in the active general board member election, and our dear Paul Oates, who's looking so handsome today in his uniform, received the majority of votes in the fire safety board member election. The committee unanimously approved the election results. Are there any questions regarding this item?
I want to know if we can get honorary uniforms that we can all sort of honor Paul by wearing one.
There's junior firefighter uniform.
Yeah, I don't know what to say to all that attention.
No red Speedos?
Whoops. All right, let's clean it up here. Okay. Moving to consent agenda item number 2, appointment of Mia Horensky and Gary McCormick to a second term as independent non-board member of the audit committee. SDCERS uses an audit committee which includes 3 members of our community that are independent of our board and our plan sponsors. 2 of these audit committee members have completed their first 4-year term and seek reappointment to a second 4-year term. We have been very fortunate to have their service during the past 4 years, and we will be well served with their reappointment for a second term. The committee unanimously approved recommending the board reappoint Mia Horensky and Gary McCormick. Are there any questions regarding this item? I want to tell you, these 2 people are partners in an accounting firm. This is their busy season. It's always their busy season. They are so well qualified, and we are lucky to have them on the audit committee. So I would encourage you to approve this motion.
Keep going.
Staff's recommendation to approve the SDCERS action plan for fiscal year ending June 30. The committee approved the fiscal year action plan. The action plan is updated every year to include projects above and beyond the regular daily business operations in an effort to find new ways to improve how we serve our members, protect the trust, and strengthen our governance. The action plan is a living document in that it can be amended for newly identified critical projected during the year. Are there any questions or comments about this item?
Yes.
Why, Chris? Oh, Lisa?
I was just curious, Greg, if you can just highlight some of the key action plan items for the board.
Yes. When I was discussing this item yesterday at the committee level, I kind of made it an analogy when I first joined the system 7 years ago, how we were looking into the future and how do we set ourselves up for success. And that big challenge that we were looking at was reopening the city plan. And while it didn't show up exactly on our action plan, a lot of the pieces of the action plan put us in position for that success. And I find ourselves at another inflection point currently where we're looking at really kind of like disruptive technology, which everybody talks about these days as artificial intelligence. It's at our doorstep and it's coming forward, and we're getting more and more examples of how maybe some of our business problems can be solved with this new technology. And so there's quite a few pieces of our action plan which set us up for future success in that area. And namely is our IT strategic plan, where we're looking at revitalizing our operations, our technology environment, to make sure that we're up to date in our environments and also moving towards the next, I guess, iteration of how information technology is being put forth. And that has to do with our benefit system upgrade. It was a little bit, we'll be talking about the Sagitech solution and upgrading that, which is part of that plan. So that helps us get ready for AI applications, and also the move to Microsoft 365 in the cloud. So those pieces are really critical for our future success. The other piece is artificial intelligence. It's only as smart as what you teach it. And so going through and making sure that all of our business rules and how we operate the trust are documented and are effective is very critical. And our SDCERS University and our benefits administration area, while we're looking at that in the short term, is really a great way to do succession planning and making sure that we can train people to make sure that they're putting out quality service. It really is the foundation of building an information set where you can teach IA and leverage that knowledge to make sure that's correct. And then the third piece is quality data. And that, while it's not specifically in the action plan, it's always been a critical component to benefit administration. The old adage, garbage in, garbage out, you want to make sure you don't have any garbage in your data. So going through and cleaning data on a regular basis, and we do that as we go through and do benefit administration. So those would be some of the key projects that I'd like to highlight. There is 24 projects in there. We could probably spend the rest of the day deep diving into all of them, but I'd be glad to answer any questions about them.
Any questions for Greg?
I think Chris had one.
Oh, not for Greg, but and apologies, I was unable to attend the committee yesterday because I was at a court case representing actually the city of San Diego in a civil case. But so I had a number of questions that I was able to get resolved, but I have one question for Karina. At a meeting, I don't know, maybe at the last meeting or whatever, I asked a question of you of how we were performing the benchmarks, and you helpfully directed me to Aon's presentation, which is, I think, pretty much every presentation they say, here's where we are compared to benchmarks. And I was at the investment committee yesterday, and I'm looking at the slide that they helpfully put out. And if I'm reading it correctly, over every time frame in the last 10 years, the benchmarks have been winning.
You are correct.
So what I'm wondering is, from an action plan perspective, and I'm assuming that's an average, right? So in some places we're probably beating the benchmarks, and some places we aren't.
True.
And I'm just wondering, from an action plan perspective, if it wouldn't be wise to evaluate those areas where we're consistently not outperforming the benchmarks and investing to the benchmarks as opposed to continuing as we have.
Thank you for the question, Chris. So I will say your observations are correct. There has been underperformance, and we have talked about this at the investment committee. When we look particularly at the 1, the 3, the 5-year returns, what we are seeing is underperformance coming from our private assets. So this would be largely private equity. And if you allow me just a moment, you know, when we do an attribution, we try to basically attribute or ascribe where did this underperformance come from? And we do it over rolling periods. So I'm just going to highlight, not going into too much detail here, but I think it's going to be pretty loud and clear. On a 1 year, we were down just about 1.3%. But almost fully 100 basis points, or 1 full percent, came from private equity. On a 3-year basis, we were down, the whole fund, just 19 basis points. We can say this is largely in line with the benchmark, but again, total private equity down 57 basis points. When we look at 5 years, rolling out, down 53 at the total fund level, private equity down 56. And in fact, when we look at, you know, the 1 year and the 3 year, we're actually seeing, the 1 and the quarter to date, we're actually seeing most recently positive asset allocation effects. So the negative draw from private equity has been so powerful to overcome performance in other parts of the portfolio. Why? The reason is because we got particularly hurt on probably an unconscious overweight to growth equity that was particularly hit hard when interest rates spiked back in 2022. And so this really did have an impact on our portfolio that bleeds through the 1, the 3, and the 5-year returns. Now, to your question, it is in the action plan. For this reason, we took it upon ourselves to increase our expertise in this area and go out to the market and do an RFP to onboard a consultant that can help us in selection, particularly in these areas of the market where manager selection is so critical. So I hope I answer your question at a high level. Again, on the public book, yes, you're correct. Some areas helped, some areas didn't do as well. Just on the last 1 year, we had some headwind from our global equity managers. They weren't as exposed to the MAG 7 stocks that did so well for the year ended 2024 calendar year. But that's more in the margin. The big picture is on the private assets and what's happening there. And we are taking an action to hire a consultant to help build and buttress the expertise in this most critical area.
Thank you. And when we get into private equities, we're kind of cemented in there for the period of time until the private equity is. So there's not a lot that can be done about that once you're in it.
I want to thank you for that observation as well. We didn't get into this spot in the last just 2 or 3 years. The investments that are now coming to harvest, the majority of those were made in 2016, 2017. These are long-term assets. So yes, these are illiquid, and we were also quite overweight private equity. This actually we have addressed through pacing. So we've really scaled back pacing. When I came on board, we were about 13.5% to private equity. That's now about 10.5%. So we really scaled back our pacing, and we've gotten less back from the advisors as well because of the exit environment being so difficult. that was good. If we had kept up with that pacing, we would have lost out on some of the higher returns in the equity market. So that was good from a relative positioning. But again, the selection effect and having this tilt toward growth equity, that really hurt when interest rates rose as quickly as they did. And that had a follow-on effect in terms of the fundraising environment, the exit environment, so we weren't getting distributions back either, and that bled into this slower rate of pacing.
Thanks. And that really helps. And are there any other segments of our investments where, because I understand private equity is a big piece of what we're looking at here.
Yeah.
Are there any other areas where the benchmarks are winning, so to speak?
Yeah, I would also point to infrastructure. But again, you know, in relation to everything, if you will, so private equity, you know, on the 1 year, down 900 basis points, on the 3 year, down 490, on the 5 year, down 490, on the 10, down 120, versus infrastructure on the 1 year, down 70, and just for reference, on the 10 year, down 50. So the bulk, again, is coming from private equity. And it had to do with our exposure more so to growth equity within that.
Thank you.
Corinna, while you're still on the microphone, could you just remind the board, what is the target allocation at present for private equity? What is the target allocation for infrastructure, please?
Sure. So private equity is obviously much larger than infrastructure. So we have a 10% allocation target to private equity. We remain slightly overweight. And we have actually increased the target to infrastructure to 4% from 3%. And we've also targeted that to be more core infrastructure, so more cash yielding and more income focused.
Thank you.
Sure.
Bobby, you can
That's
continue.
it?
Well, I could ask some other questions. But
Yeah, that's right.
Well, let's finish the committee.
Yes. Okay, moving on. We have staff's recommendation to approve the SDCERS administrative budget for June 30, 2026. And we heard from Ted, who gave a very complete, thorough, and impressive presentation. And the committee unanimously recommended approval of the SDCERS 2026 budget. The majority of the budget is labor, and staff recommends reducing staffing for 3 vacant positions. The city negotiated pay increases for both 2025 and the anticipated 2026 are the primary reason for the 5% increase in the total budget. Are there any questions regarding the budget? Because Ted is here and ready to answer them.
No, the report was very thorough. Thank you.
Then we have staff's recommendation to approve a work order with Sagitech Solutions to replace the pension administration software's workflow engine. Michelle provided history on the selection of the Sagitech benefit administration software using an RFP process in 2011, the nature of this relationship as a long-term strategic partnership, the critical need to complete this project, as well as an explanation on the cost, of the cost effectiveness of our current software compared to changing an alternative provider. The committee approved the work order at a cost not to exceed $240,000. Then we had staff's recommendation to amend the contracting policy and delegation of authority to execute contracts and other documents, the education policy, the travel and expense reimbursement policy, and Division 6 of the board rules. The proposed amendments were non-substantive clarifications and administrative edits, which the committee approved unanimously. Are there any questions from the board before I move for approval on consent agenda items 1 through 6? Hearing none. It's moved by Paul. Please record your votes.
And with all votes in, Madam Chair, this motion passes 10-0.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bobby, for that report. That was a lengthy report. Thank you so much.
I have 3 more little
Oh, you
things to
still have
say.
3 more, okay.
Just little things. We had reports from staff. Natasha presented the Member Services report, Sandra, the Benefits Administration Division report, and Michelle, the IT Division report. And the remainder of the reports were written, legal, finance, and members owing in excess of $10,000. Are there any questions and comments from the board? If not, back to you.
All right, now, thank you so much. So now we'll move to Section 9 for the Investment Committee, and I'll turn it over to Cliff to give an Investment Committee report.
Thank you very much. The Investment Committee met yesterday afternoon here in this room and covered 1 action item and 3 information items. The action item pertains to manager selection and is therefore delegated to the Investment Committee. I will provide a brief summary of this item, but no additional vote is needed. The action item is, or was, the approval of a $50 million commitment to the Antares Senior Loan Fund Number 3 for the private debt portfolio. This fund is a closed-end fund focused on originating senior secured loans to private equity-owned companies in the core middle market in the United States. Antares is one of the most experienced investors in the space with a proven track record of investing through cycles, a very experienced investment team, and a strong network of source deals. This investment complements the existing investments in the private debt portfolio and will continue to build out SDCERS direct lending exposure. This item was approved unanimously by the committee members present. No additional vote is needed. We're not going to have, Corinna, do you or staff want to make any comments on this, or do you think we've covered it?
No, we covered it in the investment committee meeting, and we do believe it's a good complement to the other managers that we have recently hired for direct lending. Thank you.
Sure. The investment committee also covered 3 information items at the meeting yesterday. The first item is an introductory presentation for the asset liability study, the results of which will be presented at the May meeting. I will now turn things over to Aon to give a short presentation on this.
And we're welcoming Phil Kavarkis and Ashley Woosty. Phil is the actuary who has worked on our plan last couple of go-rounds. So welcome, Phil.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karina. So good morning, everyone. So today's objective is really just to kick off the asset liability study, which we run for the plan every 3 years. You all might be familiar with the asset allocation process, which is something that we update annually, but the asset liability study really digs deeper. And what it does is it looks at your asset mix and compares it to the context of your liabilities. So it's been 3 years. The last time we conducted the study was roughly 2021 to 2022 timeframe. And now is a great time to take a fresh look at this and see what really has changed and to make sure that your risk posture within the asset mix is still appropriate given the updated circumstances that we see. So today, our goal is to, again, just talk about our methodology and our process at a high level, what we plan to look at when we're doing this study, and Phil's going to walk through that. He'll also give a brief introduction into our capital market assumptions and how we set those. And we'll talk about kind of the objectives of the study and give a brief overview of the timeline for what's to come. So to kind of take a step back, and when you think about your asset class mix, what we talk about a lot is your risk posture. And we're looking at the difference between your return-seeking and your risk-reducing assets. Your return-seeking assets are really intended to grow your portfolio, right? You are underfunded. So in order to close that funding gap, we still need growth. So primarily, this is going to be your equities, both public and private, but also credit and things of that nature. And then risk reducing, these are the assets that should help protect, particularly on the downside, that left tail risk. You're going to diversify the sources of returns and hopefully avoid having huge drawdowns, particularly in periods of market stress. So when we say 22% risk reducing, this is your core kind of fixed income portfolio, your investment grade bond portfolio. And then the 78% return seeking portfolio, that really is everything else. But just keep in mind that that also includes some diversifying asset classes. So you have some trend following hedge funds there, private debt, core real assets. So really what we're going to be doing is looking at the entire portfolio in context as a whole to see what the risk posture should be given these updated circumstances. And then you can see at the bottom here, again, these are some of the things that we'll look at when thinking about what the asset class mix should look like that is in context with your plan's liabilities. So time horizon, how long it's going to take to get to full funding, whether it's a more mature or a more active plan can impact this, your level of funded status, and liquidity needs as well. So these are all of the factors that we'll look into. Any questions so far? Otherwise, I'll turn it to Phil to just give a high-level overview of our methodology and what we plan to do with the study.
All right. Well, so as we've already discussed, the last study was run 2021, 2022, and so it's time for the updated asset liability study. Again, we're going to take a fresh look at the assets and liabilities and the situation of the plan. Here's a snapshot of a recap of our findings from the 2021-2022 study. Generally, three facets of analysis when we run a study: portfolio analysis, an asset liability projection analysis, and a liquidity stress test. The purpose of the portfolio analysis is to ensure that the portfolio is efficiently constructed. The purpose of the asset liability projection analysis is to examine the state of the plan today and how it trends into the future. And so we'll examine things like funding ratio trend lines. And then liquidity analysis, we want to make sure that even in the most stressed of markets, there's sufficient liquidity to maintain fund operations. You're able to pay out your benefit payments, et cetera. So those are the three types of analysis that we'll run as part of this forthcoming asset liability study. The next page shows a quick snapshot of how we would conduct this analysis, and we'll generally run projections of expected asset and liability performance over time, but we're not just going to run one expected case over the next 30 years, let's say. We're going to run the expected case, but also a variety of optimistic and pessimistic cases. So not just one economic trial, but rather 5,000 economic trials, which include the best of times, the worst of times, and everything in between. And with that, you'll be able to examine not just the expected case, but also what happens in the optimistic cases and what happens in the pessimistic cases, so that you're fully informed, you can make a fully informed decision on the investment strategy for the plan. This page summarizes the starting point of the analysis as of June 30 of 2024. The actuaries have already covered these numbers in great detail. You can see that the assets and liabilities and funded ratios are shown here for the city plan, the port district, and the airport authority. You can see, for example, the city plan has a market value of assets of about $10.4 billion, liabilities of $13.8 billion, 75.3% funded. For the city plan. That'll be the starting point for our analysis, our projection analysis. And so that you'll see funding ratios start at 75% and project forward from there. The same with Port District, 78.8%, and the Airport Authority, 94.3%. Also on the page, you'll notice liability growth rates. Now, anytime you're thinking about, well, how much should the assets grow, we think it's really important to understand, well, how the liabilities are growing. Because your assets are intended to cover the liabilities over time, you want to make sure that you're informed as far as what the liabilities are growing going forward, and in order to ensure that the assets are positioned to cover those liabilities over time. So we're going to examine not just the starting point, but also what are the assets and liabilities growing by today and into the future. Next page covers some changes, the changes since the last study. So you'll recall the last study used 6/30/2021 numbers as the starting point. And you can see funding ratios in the top table. For example, the city plan had a funding ratio of 82.4% in 2021, and now 75.3% is the latest and greatest. You'll notice that's a change of 7.1%, a drop of 7.1%. A variety of things contributed to that. As an example, those pay increases that the actuaries just talked about. So higher pay increases meant higher liabilities meant lower funding ratio, all else equal. So the funding ratios are summarized here. Liability growth rates as well. So you'll recall the liability growth rate, 8.87%. You can see how that changed over since the last study. All right, next page covers the portfolio analysis, the first cut portfolio analysis. And you can see there's a graph on the left side of the page. Vertical axis is the expected return on assets. Horizontal axis is the volatility of those portfolio returns. You can see for the total portfolio, using our latest and greatest capital market assumptions, 7.45% expected asset return for the current portfolio with 10.81% volatility. And you can see the current portfolio is a diversified makeup of several different asset classes. You can see that in the table on the right. You can also see the individual asset classes as colored dots in the graph on the left.
Phil, quick question. In the footnotes, it says that these assumptions were as of the end of the calendar year, just a handful of weeks ago. There's been a lot of volatility since then, and yet these are very long-term assumptions. So can you describe for us in summary form, since I know we're going to get, this is just an introduction today, we're going to get a much longer discussion at the meeting in May, sort of how, in general, are shorter-term factors folded into the longer term? I mean, this is like decades long.
That's right.
These numbers, right?
That's right.
So since we get the news here as civilians every day, how should we kind of go back and forth of thinking, when you're having your eggs and bacon in the morning, you're looking at the paper or listening to the news, what you're hearing versus thinking 30 years out? How do you all deal with that?
Sure. Well, I'll start with maybe how we set the return assumption. Again, it's very long-term, as you mentioned. And then how we set our volatilities and correlations. And maybe the easier conversation is to talk first about how we set the volatilities and correlations. Generally speaking, those are historically based. So we can observe historical volatilities and correlations. And generally speaking, our forward-looking expectations for volatilities and correlations are historically based. Returns are going to be set in different consistent methodologies with how we set them quarter over quarter. But for example, fixed income return expectations is generally the yield. What's the observable yield on the bond? Well, that's the best predictor as to what the return expectation for the bond would be. For equities, for example, we use a dividend discount model. So we take forecasted earnings for example, the S&P 500. And so we use those forecasted earnings. We discount that back to determine the discount rate that sets those forecasted earnings, present value equal to the current level of the S&P 500 at the end of every quarter. And that's the implied market-based expected return for the S&P 500. And we'll do that for the Russell 2000. We'll do that for international equities as well, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how we're setting return expectations now. The reality is that's just the central expectation. And of course, there can be noise. We've seen it. We've seen it over the past month or so. And so that's why we run the 5,000 economic trials, right? Because we don't know what the central case will be. Rather, we want to make sure that, when we run the distribution of outcomes, the 5,000 economic trials, we're including the best of times and the worst of times and everything in between. And so that ensures that, somewhere in those 5,000 trials, you'll get a COVID. Somewhere in those 5,000 trials, you'll get a global financial crisis. Somewhere in 5,000 trials, you'll get the dot-com bubble burst. And so that's the point of running the 5,000, because we want to make sure that we're capturing all the things that can happen. And to take that one step further, if you think about a normal bell curve, the tails are fairly narrow at the end. And what we've seen throughout market history is fat tails. In other words, tails wider than your standard normal distribution might imply. Our distribution reflects fat tails. So in other words, we don't want to underrepresent what those risks might look like. And so we do have fat tails that are baked into the analysis. So when we say, well, your 75% funding ratio is expected to grow to 100% over the next, 15 years, there'll be a distribution of outcomes. The most optimistic of cases and the most pessimistic of cases are considering those fat tails. And so what might happen in the worst of times? Well, you might be below 75, but that's forthcoming. That's what we'll examine.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. All right, interest of time. One more point on the capital market assumptions. We benchmark our capital market assumptions on an annual basis. And so you can see this page across the bottom of the page shows a variety of different asset classes that are portrayed. The Horizon Survey is a survey of 41 investment advisors every year where they examine the field of investment advisors' capital market assumptions for each of these asset classes. The distribution of assumptions is shown for each asset class. Aon's assumption is the blue dot. And generally speaking, Aon runs middle of the pack. Not always in every asset class, but generally speaking, Aon runs fairly middle of the pack when you examine our assumptions versus the field of investment advisors. That's been generally true for the last several years. So we like being in the middle of the pack. We don't want to be overly skewed unless we have a strong belief in an asset class. But generally speaking, we lie middle of the pack. It means we believe we have an unbiased view of the markets. Okay, so that benchmark is important. We want to make sure that we remain middle of the pack, or understand why we're not if we're not. All right, this page shows some portfolio analysis. We just took that analysis for the current policy, and here you can see the 7.45% in the middle of the page. That's the central expectation for the current policy, and of course, the returns over the next 30 years could be higher or lower than that central expectation. And so you can see the returns on a cumulative basis over the 30-year period could be as low as 4.27% in our model and as high as 10.72% in our model. So quite a wide range of outcomes over the 30-year period. And then you can see as you move from left to right on this page, as you're moving from 60% return seeking to 70 to the current to 90 to 100, you're increasing your risk level. And you can see that the central expectation is increasing from 6.99% to 7.94% as you scan from left to right. And then the distribution of outcomes is increasing too. You're taking more risk as you're moving from left to right on the page. You can also see how these distributions compare to the actuarial rate of return of 6.5%. You can see that all the expectations on this page lie slightly above that actuarial assumed interest rate. All right, and the last thing I'll cover is liquidity analysis. And here, just to say, we're going to run that liquidity stress test. This is just an illustration. This isn't your numbers. We're going to run a liquidity stress test just to ensure, as I mentioned earlier, that even in the most stressed of market environments, that the portfolio has sufficient liquidity to maintain operations, that you have sufficient funds to pay out your benefit obligations every year over the next 10 years in our liquidity stress test. All right, objectives, one of the things as we're thinking about, as you're absorbing the information that we're presenting, one of the things that you might want to consider is, well, what is our desired funding ratio goal? What is our cost goal? What's our risk goal? So as you think about funded status, for example, what's the desired funding ratio? I think it was the airport authority that was targeting 95 or above. What is the funding ratio goal, and when? And when do you want to get there? So for example, you might say, well, we're 75%, we want to hit 100% in the next 20 years. Okay, well, that might show you a trend line. Or maybe you're comfortable getting there in 30 years. Well, that would show you a shallower trend line. It would, if you have more time, perhaps you can take less risk along the way, right? So there are pros and cons of different approaches in terms of funded status goals. Similarly with cost goals. Perhaps you want a lower cost, and that might mean more risk, or the converse is also true. And the same thing with downside risk. How much downside risk are you willing to absorb? So these are the types of things that we'll illuminate as part of the asset liability study for your consideration so that you can make ultimately a fully informed decision
on the best investment strategy for the plan. All right, and with that, we're at the timeline, and back to you.
Yep, just quick recap on a timeline here. So again, we started collecting the data from Gene Analysis, and we will be running the analysis over the coming weeks, and we'll be working closely with Karina and team to kind of refine and run different asset mixes and see what we want to show to you all. And we plan to bring the final analysis and results to the May meeting, and then obviously we can always tweak them as needed based on feedback that we have. Once that risk posture is set, the kind of 78-22 that we refer to, then we'll look at your asset allocation mix and just refine that as needed. So things like, do you have the right allocation to public equity versus private debt versus real assets, things like that. So that will likely occur over the summer. And then after that, we'll continue to work on structure, things like core versus non-core in your private markets, active versus passive in public markets, and update the IPS as needed as well. So this will probably take us through the rest of 2025 to kind of do the full cycle, but that's the plan at this stage, is to come back with full analysis in May. So maybe I'll open it up to see if there's any questions or comments.
I do have a question. So as you develop the risk posture for the trust, along with the risk posture of this board, how do you engage our risk posture in your analysis, the board?
So when we present the results of the analysis, we can iterate. So for example, let's say that we run some analysis and we show the current portfolio and alternative portfolios. And let's say, well, you're not quite comfortable with the current risk level. You'd like to drop the risk level, but perhaps the 70% return-seeking portfolio is maybe a little bit, the trend line is a little bit too low. We can then start to refine. We can start to triangulate and refine portfolios in between those 2 points. And so, there's an iterative process we intend. So we'll share in May, we'll share the initial results of our analysis. Mm-hmm. But to the extent there are questions or follow-up questions or additional requests, we're happy to produce those as well. So the intent here is to spend time dotting the I's and crossing the T's to make sure that we're fully capturing your feedback along the way.
Okay, so there'll be an opportunity for the board to change the risk. I guess Karina, I'm curious, how are you going to engage us so that you can understand what our risk posture is? That's what I'm trying to understand.
Thank you, Madam President. So I think, as Phil noted, it's a pretty robust study, and I think that the level of risk is going to be very dependent upon how our funded status has actually developed and what the go forward is. Like when you look at some of the numbers in the projected asset allocation return of 7.45%, and you compare that with the asset hurdle rate that we're going to need to earn, you have to get there through some contributions. And it's also a question for the contribution volatility, right? So the less risk you take, the more stable the contributions are, both for employers and employees. So that's also something to factor in. It's a multifaceted decision that takes into account also our liquidity needs. We're bleeding more monthly than what we're taking in. So that also plays a role in terms of the amount we're going to be able to invest in illiquid assets as well. So all of this has to be factored in. I think we're eagerly waiting preliminary results, but to that end, Ms. President, we will share those with the board ahead of the meeting, and we'll certainly be working closely with Cliff as a chair of the investment committee in the interim leading up to the May meeting. But we did delay this study a month or two, so the kickoff was delayed, and that was to take into account the most updated actuarial valuation that you just approved. So we wanted the numbers to fully reflect Prop B and the increase in salary that we've experienced. So we wanted to be working with fresh numbers, as fresh as we could, to provide a more robust study.
If I can expand on this question about risk, I think it would be very helpful for everyone on the board, and certainly the investment committee, that when we have these focused conversations, that we talk about risk as not one thing, but as potentially multiple factors. And we've just touched quickly on two, just to highlight. One is liquidity risk, which of course is extraordinarily important since we have to pay, our job is to pay the promised benefits. Well, yeah, and a couple thousand other folks too. And in addition, a lot of people talk about risk as return volatility, which is very, very valid. We're going to hear about that as well, but there are additional risks, and I think it would be very helpful to see if we can, as best possible, unpack that four-letter word of risk into various components, just to make certain that we get an understanding on the board, and then we can make what we hope will be the best possible decision, given everything we know at the time.
Earlier in the presentation, you were talking sort of generally speaking about how being at the funded level that we are, that we would most likely wish to take greater risk than we might if we were at 100% funding. I think that's what you said. And I've definitely heard that concept at pension conferences and so forth, that the 100% funded pension funds don't take a lot of risk because they're comfortable being where they are and they don't need to take the risk. What I'm struggling with on that, though, is that the pension fund that is funded at 75%, by taking higher risk, has a potential for going up, but has a higher risk of going down as well, and is more vulnerable than that pension fund that's at 100%. So I'm having a hard time sort of accepting the basic premise that the less than 100% fund should be taking higher risk. And I think our private equity experience may bear that out. That, I mean, there was an effort here to chase alpha, I guess is what you call it, right? And with respect to private equity, so far, that's actually weighed us down. It hasn't worked out for us.
So to your point about, it's not obvious that you take more risk at 75% than you would at 100%. The purpose of the study is to illuminate all of your options so that you can make the best decision for your plan. And so what you described is the general prevalence of pension funds is that they are, when they're looking to increase their funding ratio, generally speaking, the pension universe has taken a little bit more risk along the way when they're underfunded than when they're fully funded. Because the goal is often to get there and stay there, right? So you want to get from 75 to 100 and then stay there, and so take risk down such that you can change your trajectory from up to sideways with as little risk as possible. So that's the general theme. But the purpose of the study is to customize the analytics for this governing body, and it's ultimately to make the best decision for this plan. So we're not going to come in with preconceived notions. Rather, we intend to take a fresh look and lead you to the best answer as you see fit.
And Chris, if I may just also add, private equity since inception has been our highest returning asset class. So it's on an absolute basis that it is since inception 14.6%. And that is actually ahead of the benchmark on a since inception basis and ahead of every other asset class. But that's sort of to be expected because there's a lot of risk involved, as you noted, and now more near term as we have seen. But just wanted to note that that did help improve the overall assets in the plan through that asset growth. It's just on a relative comparison, the benchmark that we're benching that against, it did not perform as strongly. Still the strongest performing asset class since inception.
If I can please just make a few comments. I really appreciated Chris's question. And when I listen to that, I kind of separate two things. Chris's question was more theoretical, And in that, it's not taking greater or less risk. It's really the appropriate level of risk. And I think when I hear our experts talking about operating this asset liability model, they're kind of at the more granular level. Are you turning up or down that risk level? Is it greater, less risk? Because there's lots of theoretical discussions in the pension community. Should you take risk at all? You have people that say, well, if you take no risk, you just put it into cash. Is that the appropriate level of risk? Or there's a group out there that says, well, we should just be tied to just safe bonds, either government bonds. That's one level of risk. Do you have other folks that say, well, I like modern portfolio theory and do different levels of risk in different asset classes? So to me, it's more of talking about what is the appropriate level of risk. And I think that's what this asset liability study is. But I wouldn't get caught too much as a greater risk or less risk at a particular funding level.
And
Okay, I'm with you. I'm just, all I'm suggesting is I don't think that a pension fund that is below its target has a good reason to take higher risk to try to get there.
so maybe it would help too to think, so you're not necessarily trying to take higher risk, but you do need to grow the portfolio. So what we're trying to do is figure out how to achieve a higher level of return, and what level of risk are you comfortable with to get that higher level of return. And that's really where, again, the diversification comes into play, because I think one of the risks is volatility of returns, and you're paying benefit payments. You don't want to see a huge drop in assets overnight that takes a long time to recover. And so what we're trying to do really is smooth your journey, right? Trying to have, maybe you're going to miss out on huge upside, like in 2023 and 2024 when the stock markets were up 30%. But then when you have a year like 2022 when the stock markets are crashing, that kind of offsets. So we're trying to get a smooth return, but you do still need to grow the portfolio. So I don't think it's maybe we want to take more risk, but when you are 75% funded, you need the return. So that's going to come with more risk. So
And
hopefully
the
that
smooth-
helps
the
a little
smooth-
bit.
The
Yeah.
smooth journey is important when your funding ratio is 75%, because you want to limit the downside at that point. But just to say it, I mean, we're going to present the full spectrum. And there's a cost and risk trade-off. And so, for example, as Greg was, I'm sure it was a theoretical exercise, but you could consider an all-bond portfolio. It'll have much lower risk, but it'll have a higher cost. Mm-hmm. On the flip side, you could have an all return-seeking portfolio that will have a lower expected cost and much greater risk. And there's an entire spectrum along the way. And so, the intent for the exercise is to examine the full spectrum and to start honing in on what we believe is the right zone based on everything that we've heard. And then we'll iterate. So to the extent we present this in May and collect feedback from you or along the way, we'll collect feedback from you and then start to hone in on what we believe is the right zone. And so we'll start to triangulate on the right answer for this plan.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. When you guys do your dark sky scenario, do you consider the risk factors not associated with the portfolio, specifically the risk of default by the city on their contribution payments, massive cutbacks in employment levels because of the budget deficit situation? Are those how do we factor those in? You talk about risk from a portfolio standpoint, but there's a bunch of other risks that's sitting out here that I'm not sure how we get our arms around that overall relative to the portfolio.
Yes, excellent. So I'll describe the dark skies analysis in our liquidity stress test. It's a 10-year projection, but it's 3 years of significant market downturn with limited to no recovery thereafter. And over the 3 years, the market gets cut in half, minus 50% over a 3-year period with limited recovery. So that's the extent of the market impact in our dark skies analysis. Now, what we can and have done is to say, well, in that, if the market gets cut in half, the city's finances might be strained. And if the city's finances might be strained, well, what happens if now the city can't contribute everything that the city's supposed to contribute? And so we can further stress test the contributions. So to take that a step further, beyond just the market stress, we can also take into account city funding stress. And so that would double up that risk exposure, as you might expect, and show a slightly different picture. So we're happy to produce that as well.
I would like to take a look. I tend to, everybody refers to me as the Prince of Darkness.
It's your scenario.
I don't want to pollute your dark sky scenario, but I think it'd be very interesting to take a look at a really a worst case scenario, just to get appreciation of what the risk factors in there might be for non-portfolio risk aspects.
Yeah, absolutely. And to take that a step further, to the extent we're iterating, if the group's consensus would be to examine other stress tested scenarios, we're happy to run those as well. The actuary presented some stress test scenarios for you today. We're happy to run those as part of the analysis, and so we intend to collect that feedback along the way.
Thank you.
Okay, in interest in time, can we move on? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I'll turn it back over to Cliff.
Thank you very much. And as a retired bond portfolio manager, there are a lot of risks in having a 100% bond portfolio. It's not necessarily low risk, so we'll get back to that another day. Continuing on the information items, before I turn things back over to the chair, two other items of note, one about real estate and one about the overall performance of the portfolio. The SDCERS real estate consultant, Makita, gave an update on the annual investment plan. So far in fiscal 25, SDCERS has committed $205 million of its target $240 million in commitments for the year. In addition, Makita provided education on new property types in the real estate index. The index is changing slightly, including self-storage. These are sectors in which SDCERS may elect to invest in the future. As to performance, the total fund returned a negative 0.9% for the fourth quarter of 2024, performing roughly in line with the benchmark return of negative 0.8% for the period. For the calendar year, the total fund returned positive 6.8% net, underperforming the benchmark return of 8.1%. Underperformance over the year, as Corinna has touched on earlier, was primarily the result of underperformance in the private equity, global equity, and diversifying allocations. Although recent performance has been impacted by underperformance in the private equity portfolio, the long-term performance of the fund remains strong. Over the past 10 years, the fund's risk-adjusted return is in the top quartile compared to similarly sized public pension plans. And with that, I'm finished with my report and turn things back over to the
Thank you,
chair.
Cliff, for the investment committee report. So we'll take a 10-minute break, and the board, I'd like for you to all join for a picture with our esteemed Tom.
Yeah, if we could all just right here in the middle would be great right now. That'd be great.
And then, Chris has a
Maybe we,
question he would like
Greg,
to answer.
maybe get the SDCERS logo up there too.
Thank you, everyone. I know this is my big moment, right?
Don't blow it.
Thank you, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting back to order. Rosie, do I need to ask if we still have a quorum, or I think we're still okay? We've had a couple of people.
Yes, we still have a quorum.
Still have a quorum.
Sorry, I quickly had to do a head count here.
Before we move on, for Greg, I guess we would open the floor to questions and comments from trustees. Because Chris, I believe you have a question?
I actually had a question on the investment committee side. So yesterday's meeting, Cliff, there was a discussion about Aon's contract, and if I understood correctly, that it was a 5-year contract that had expired or is almost to expire.
It expires in April.
Expires, thank you. And that there is the potential for 2 one-year extensions. And I had 2 questions on that. One is, normally when I see contracts along those lines with extensions, the extensions are for unexpected consequences, right? Well, you don't have to say yes, just for unexpected consequences. And I was wondering why in this case, and maybe this is not a question for you, this didn't come to the board earlier about, hey, this is going to expire and what should we do? And the second question was, who has the authorization under whatever the contract is to decide we're going to do an extension?
Karina, do you want to discuss?
Yes, thank you, Chris. This is actually something I wanted to bring up in staff comments, but I'm happy to do so now. So as I mentioned at the investment committee meeting, Aon's 5-year, originally 10-year contract expires here in April. And there was already negotiated at the outset of the contract 2 one-year extensions built in. I don't necessarily think that it's just due to unusual circumstances, but even so, in this case, we do have our big asset liability modeling study coming due, and as I just mentioned, that was delayed as well to make sure we're using the freshest valuation numbers. So we think with this big study outstanding, and also in light of the work that Aon has done for us as a general investment consultant, we didn't have impetus to make a change in our GIC for the coming year. And again, this is already built into their contracts. So in terms of delegation, I'm probably going to defer to Johnny on that one, but I do believe it's in the staff's purview to execute the additional 1-year extension. I defer to Johnny.
Thanks. The board has reserved a few items just for the board's approval, and so the selection of a general consultant is subject to the board's approval.
So how does that answer Karina's question? I think her question, sorry.
So if I can jump in there, we would need, the staff would have to raise this issue with the investment committee and the board and ask their approval to extend that contract. So
that hasn't happened yet.
Right.
If I
So
heard things
the way I
correctly.
look at it is we have a general policy to make sure that we're getting a good value for the service providers that we have. And so the one way we do that is you go out to the marketplace and say, you know, I really like this vendor, but am I getting a good deal, yes or no? And so you do a request for proposal, you look at everything coming back, you weigh, are they still the best service provider? Are they giving us a good fee? So that's why we do things periodically. And 5 years seems to be kind of a good benchmark for reevaluating services. And we want to make sure that the boards have a very, very close relationship with a high dollar spend. That's what the board has told us. So that's why the board is involved in that respect. For me, it comes down to what was said when the board hired this vendor. What was the motion? Was it meant to be that way? And I'd have to go back and look to see, was it staff has the authority for 5, 1 + 1? Was it authority for 5? You know, that type of thing. But we'll be bringing that to have a better discussion with the investment committee as we move forward.
Okay, but just from a practical perspective, the contract theoretically expires in April, and so I guess the board won't have an opportunity to decide to extend it until May, if indeed it's required that the board is the one who needs to extend it.
I agree with that, and I think in that scenario, we'll have to go back and look at the record, and maybe staff should have been a little bit more timely in its request.
Okay, well, Aon, maybe you guys would be willing to work gratis for a month until May?
I actually want to allow Jamie to say a few words, as she was more involved with the contracting at the time. And then plus, I wanted to also mention we had a similar instance just at the turn of the year with Makita, where staff again extended that contract for a year. We told the board at the time, so this would be the second time that we're taking this approach. But Jamie, go ahead.
Thanks, Grina. And thanks for the question, Chris. So I was involved in the contracting process when we brought Aon back on board. And part of the board's, as Greg was also mentioning, part of what the board approved was the initial term of 5 years with the 2 one-year extensions. That was approved at the board, and that's why it did not come back to the board when we were exercising that extension option. So what we simply do is we exercise the option, and then we make sure that we communicate it to the board.
So it sounds like we've got a legal issue and a sort of standard issue.
No.
But all I would suggest is it would be nice, regardless of how the system, can work, if we just got notified far enough in advance of the termination of the contract, so if somebody has a concern, they can bring it up.
We can certainly do that going forward.
Thank you.
So then for clarification purposes, where do we stand now? So do we need?
We have a contract with Aon that is good through the end of April, actually April 2026.
Great. So we don't need to ask anyone to work gratis.
No.
No.
Good.
And Jamie, thank you for the clarification. I'm sorry, I was following the policy, but again, like Greg said, like you said, if the board had already approved those extensions and given the authority, then that's a delegation of that decision.
And that's typically how we structure any of those recommendations that come forward for consultants, for the bank, or other examples of institutions that we would try to make sure we have extension options built in to those contracts.
Any other questions from board members? Greg, you have any comments?
Yes. Well, thank you.
Oh, wait, I had one. Well, I can do it after you.
No, go.
Oh, all right. He always wants to go last, so. At the retreat, we spent a lot of time on this issue of how we deal with issues where we have overcompensated folks, and if there's some way to be able to waive that. And I just wanted to read some fan mail from a retiree. One of a woman, Katie Gonzalez, who is a former assistant personnel director, sent me an email and said, "Kudos to you and to the board members and staff who are seeking a solution for those retirees impacted by an overpayment error. All members should feel fortunate to have you as an advocate on behalf of retirees. Thank you for your leadership. Please forward this message to others involved in your effort as a sign of gratitude for those who may be impacted." Thank you.
Thank you. Is that it?
I could come up with something else, but I think that's it.
All right. Well, thank you, Cliff. To begin my comments, I wanted to echo our board president's praises for the board members who are celebrating the completion of a 4-year term on the board, and will be turning for another 4-year term. Lisa Marie, Michelle, Brett, and Paul L. Because we've got 2 Pauls. Got to make sure you get the right Paul.
Well, this is the Prince of Darkness here.
So thank you for your service. I look forward to working with you in the coming years. Also, our 3 board members who are finishing a 4-year term, Bobby, Louis, and Tom, thank you for your service and dedication during your board service. And a special note of appreciation to Bobby and Louie, who have the ability to carry over and who are carrying over. So thank you. And did you know the Girl Scouts of San Diego honors exemplary women whose personal and professional lives make them quintessential role models for girls? These cool women inspire girls to chase their dreams and reach their full potential. The Girl Scouts of San Diego is recognizing Lisa Marie Harris for being a Cool Woman finalist at their Cool Woman celebration, which is happening right now. And if you're really quiet, you can hear her call her name. I'm pretty sure. Looking at our board calendar, I see that we have an SDCERS networking educational event tentatively scheduled for April 9th. However, it's come to my attention that we also have a social networking event being held at Mr. Brewster's house on April 4th. So the goal is really to get us together to spend time together and strengthen relationships. So with that, I think if no one objects, we'll take that April 9th event and postpone that till later in the year. And I just wanted to thank Chris for opening his home and giving the board that opportunity to have non-board related business social events. So thank you. I would like to recognize and thank the member services team to reach out 5 of our members who were in the areas impacted by the Pacific Palisades and Eaton Canyon fires. We reached out to them just to make sure that they had access to their retirement benefits during a very understandable time of stress. So thank you, member services team. I really appreciate that. And on a monthly basis, we conduct email phishing with staff to test their cybersecurity skills and reinforce good cybersecurity practices. In January and February, we had 1 failure each month. Different staff, but you know that's why we test. We also have quarterly phishing with the board. We got our results for December. Of the 15 board recipients, 5 opened the email and then deleted it. Nobody clicked on anything, nobody replied, and no one opened the attachment. Nice work, board. 100%, you passed.
Well, the other people don't even check their email, apparently.
In closing, I would like to recognize the 2024 Cake Bake-Off winners. Taking the bronze medal for her now world-famous cookies and cream triple layer cake, Jamie Hamrick.
Nice.
Taking the extraordinary dessert-related silver medal was Melanie Peter with her chocolate mousse cake with candied nuts in the middle of it. It was just simply delicious. And in a ratatouille moment, taking the gold was John Hansley with his mom's flourless chocolate cake recipe.
Wow.
Who knew going gluten-free could taste so dang good? All right, thank you. This concludes my remarks.
Thank you, Greg. I missed this. Are there any reports from any folks who attended education sessions they want to share with the group? Okay, seeing none. We're now going to move on to section 11, closed session. Johnny, are there any matters to discuss in closed session today?
Yes, will we discuss the Farrington versus SDCERS matter?
Okay, fine. The board will be going into closed session. For the staff, consultants, and visitors not invited to participate in the closed session, would you please leave the room? Rosie, please stop recording the meeting while we are in closed session. Rosie, let me know when you're ready to go.
We are ready, Mr. Vice
Okay,
President.
fine. I'd like to call, we have finished the closed session and are now returning to the open session. And we'd like to move to section 12, which is the closed section report. Johnny, do we have a closed section report?
We do. The board voted 8-0 to pay the attorney's fees award in Farrington versus SDCERS by a vote of 8-0. All present.
Any other matters in the closed session to report on?
No.
So that ends your closed session report.
That does. Thank you, Cliff.
Thank you, Johnny. Hearing no other questions, we are going to move to section 13, which is adjournment. As we have come to the end of our agenda, this meeting is adjourned. Our next regular meeting will be held on May 9th, 2025 here in the SDCERS boardroom. Thank you, everyone. Get home safely. Stay dry. Have a good weekend.